But now moving into America, where we've seen here the deep wounds of racism be exposed and witnessed and maybe even participated in a rallying cry for systemic change. Acumen has long recognized that racial injustices are inextricably linked to the very systems that are exacerbating poverty in the US. Poverty and inequality persist. And it is within that context that we launched Acumen America in 2015. So this is a fund that invests across three pillars: workforce development, health, and financial inclusion. So we've continued to invest in entrepreneurs tackling these problems, from a health insurance company serving seniors of color who have been hardest hit by COVID, to a behavioral health solution for Black and Latinx youth who've been exposed to toxic stress and trauma. And throughout it all, we've remained committed to racial justice. So of the 22 companies we've invested in through Acumen America over the past 5 years, as Jacqueline mentioned earlier, 60% of these investees have a founder of color, and many of them are tackling issues of racial disparity head on. Now, if you're here in the US or even in Silicon Valley where I am, this is contrasted against the less than 1% of venture capital we see flow to Black and Latinx founders here in the US. So now I'd like to introduce Acumen America Director Amon Anderson and Abbey Wemimo and Samir Goel, co-founders of Acumen America portfolio company Esusu, who will talk with us about the ways in which they're tackling systemic racism through their work. Amon, over to you.
Thanks, Alex. And thanks to everyone who's a part of this conversation today. And just to reiterate that thank you to Abbey and Samir, we really appreciate your time and sharing your story. We're grateful for your work and your impact, your leadership, and for your voice. So thanks for being with us here today. So Abbey, Samir, I wonder if you could get us started briefly by introducing yourselves and Esusu to help set the stage. What is Esusu and what problem does it set out to solve?
Absolutely, Amon. Thank you so much, and for the Acumen America partners for inviting us to engage in this dialogue today. By way of introduction, my name is Abbey Wemimo, one of the co-founders of Esusu. And just a little bit of background story. My personal story, I grew up in Lagos, Nigeria, lost my father at a very young age, had the opportunity to come to the United States to study. So came from 80-degree weather to negative 22 degrees in Minnesota. Started my career working for President Obama's re-election campaign in Minnesota, and came to graduate school at New York University, really focused on development finance. I reconnected with President Obama's former Chief Technology Officer, Beth Novak, and where we created a company really mapping out international development dollars on the African continent. That company was acquired, and following that, worked in corporate America. But the core focus for finding Esusu was due to a personal experience. When my mother and I came to the United States, we didn't have a credit score. We walked into one of the biggest banks to borrow money, and we were turned away just because we had no financial identity. That led us to go down the streets and borrow money at over 400% interest rates from a predatory lender. My mother pawned my father's wedding ring so we can get a fighting chance and a starting point in this country. So really inspired by this experience, and after Samir and I met in graduate school, we created Esusu on three major premises: where you come from, the color of your skin, and above all, something like your financial identity shouldn't determine where you end up in the wealthiest nation on the surface of the earth. And what we do at Esusu today is work with large multi-housing providers to capture rental data and report that into the credit rating agencies. And you might ask, why is that important? The reason why that's important is reporting that data help individual tenants boost their credit scores. And for folks that have a poor credit score, they can pay over $250,000 in interest over their lifetime. And in addition, we make sure for tenants that can afford to pay rent, especially during these dire times, support them with rental relief. So as a society, we're not solving homelessness backwards. So that's a little bit about it, Esusu.
Samir, I'd love to hear a little bit about what brings you to this work as well.
Thanks, Amon. And hey, everyone, my name is Samir, one of the co-founders and co-CEOs at Esusu. Like Abbey said, this work is personal. A little bit about my background. I started out my career actually working in the public sector thought that was going to be my path to, make an impact in the world, and started working at the UN, where I just quickly got tired of bureaucracy and realized I was more hands-on as a person. And so sort of ran in the opposite direction, ended up spending some time working in food equity, built a company to address that, and spent, over 3 years building that organization, at which point I had accumulated a lot of personal and student debt and ended up spending some time in the private sector, mostly working over at LinkedIn for a little over 3 years. And, Abbey and I met now almost 8 years ago at a conference and just stayed in touch, became really good friends, now, work husbands, and started building Esusu when we saw some, traction in the market. We quit our jobs and we started building this full time at the end of 2017. But for me personally, the impetus for what we've built comes from my family. I grew up in an immigrant family from New Delhi, India, and my folks came here chasing the American dream. And it was just so much harder than it should have been. My father was mugged on his first day here. We didn't have a place for shelter. A lot of my childhood was just watching my parents work miracles with no credit, no money, and, a working understanding of English. And so when I reflected on those experiences, I just felt like it shouldn't be so hard for people that worked hard their entire lives to have a fighting chance. And so, like Abbey said, our core ethos at Esusu is no matter where you come from, the color of your skin, or your financial identity, it shouldn't determine where you end up in life. And that's really the rallying cry behind what we built and why we do what we do.
I appreciate that. Thank you both for sharing those stories. And, we both have these experiences that have shown how this financial system can really leave folks locked out. How do you think about rebuilding and fixing the system versus breaking the system down and starting all over?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, Amon. When we think about our current system, it's not working for everyday Americans, particularly Black Americans and Latino Americans. Just to go back down memory lane, the reason why it is today is because of predominantly during slavery, when African Americans came to the United States and did indeed fight for the fabric of this nation after the Civil War, and were given an opportunity to own land under Abraham Lincoln and under Andrew Jackson, that rights and 40 acres of land was taken away. That was also, underscored with the Federal Housing Administration, particularly after the after the Great Depression under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, created a huge chasm in society where African Americans were left behind and not allowed to own property. And those discriminations, although it was let go in 1968, a majority of those symptoms become the larger disease we're dealing with in society today. So some fact is the average Black family has 10 times less wealth than the average white family, which is not helpful for us as we think about society today. When you think about the work we are doing, particularly to use data to bridge the racial wealth gap, what we are trying to do is right the wrong of this country. And the way we do that is not to dismantle the current system, or rather fortify the foundation which we believe currently is built under a sinking sand. Tactically, the way we do that is credit scores play a quintessential role in people's lives to get access to finance. My case and my mother, when we came to this country, were fundamentally marginalized and not allowed to participate in the American economy, and led us to go to predatory lenders. What we are doing at Esusu now, how we think we can right the wrong, is have a tapestry of information on people. So that way, we have things like income information, we have things like your credit score, your rental information, which encompasses your largest expense on a monthly basis, and put that information together to better understand the risk profile of the individuals we work with. So that's one of the ways we think we can address the current imperfect system, but not relegate ourselves to hopeless cynicism.
Thanks, Abbey. And to quickly add to that, I think, from a tactical standpoint, the way we think about it is, what is the way in which we can have an impact in the lives of people we care about today? And how can we have a longer lasting impact in transforming the system? And so the reality is the credit system is broken. It doesn't work. It leaves a crazy amount of people behind. But the reality is we can't go to the credit bureaus and tell them that, because right now we're a startup, we're building. And so we need to think about how we can work with the existing ecosystem players, understand what their needs are, add value so that today we can have an impact in the lives of people who are left behind. Concurrently, we can learn from what's working and what's not working right now to design a better system and work towards pushing an agenda where we can actually have a more inclusive world from day one. And what that means a little more tactically is today we capture rental payment data and report it into the credit bureaus, right? That helps people build and establish their credit score. But from a longer term standpoint, we're thinking about how can mortgage lending be done better, right? How can car insurance or other types of insurance be done better? Every type of student debt refinancing, how can this be done better? So that way we're not leaving people behind. And so with that tapestry of data Abby just mentioned, we're actively working with the stakeholders to understand how we can change that system for the longer term. But to start with, we need to make sure that we're able to help people today.
I really appreciate that, Samir. And it's about how do we actually leapfrog folks to access, but your vision also incorporates making sure that when we have access to services that meet people where they are. If you access a system that's fundamentally disserving this population, that's not good enough. And I really appreciate the audacity of your vision to think about how to transform that. But I guess to sort of zero in a little bit more, what does this mean for somebody, somebody whose rent's being plugged into the Esusu database? Could you talk about the impact of an individual or a family or a community? What does it actually mean to be a part of this, the Esusu's work?
I think, Amon, one of the things it means to be part of Esusu's community is just reimagining the way we think about data and underwriting risk. So let's juxtapose. Currently, if you're not part of the Esusu community and you're within the spectrum, earning from $0 to $50,000 on an average, folks on our platform are earning $30,000 a year and have a poor credit score around 500 points. You're having access to financial products that are exorbitant, particularly when you think about interest rates. Number two, you're being shut out. In some cases, can get things like bank accounts. And number three, you can get access to mortgage products, and which we know is the biggest driver of wealth in this country. When you're in the Esusu platform, more tactically, what we do is look at your data points in an holistic manner. Number one, the folks on our platform, 80–90% of them are renters, low to medium income people. So what we're able to do, step one, is capture your rental information and then report it into the credit rating agency. So your credit score, in the eyes of that current American system, probably considered as fair or poor, can be elevated to the good level. So that way you can get access to more financial products, i.e. you're getting access to good mortgage, you're getting access to hopefully buy a car so you can drive to work and get access to a better life. Number two is not stopping there, looking at things like your financial information, your bank account transaction, and seeing real time how you're spending your money and how we can also help potential lenders understand your risk. And number three is not only giving you access to boosting your credit scores, but unlocking the potential of what that credit score can do. So on a more global, on a more national base in the United States, there are 70 million people without a credit score. And if the average mortgage in this country is around $135,000, if we do the math without any magic market sizing, you multiply both variables, that's over $9 trillion in capital we can unlock in this society. So that's not just a good thing to do, that's fundamentally prosperous for this nation. So those are some of the things we're trying to do. And even if we're able to reach half of this population and unlock $4 trillion, that's a lot of opportunities we can unlock. So that's the difference within the Esusu platform. Without Esusu, you find yourself whereby you're marginalized, high interest rates, not access to traditional products that every American should get access to. And the biggest driver of wealth, particularly home ownership, in the Esusu platform, you're able to get access to this financial product. And as a society, we're really able and serious about bridging the racial wealth gap.
Appreciate that, Abby. We'd like to build on it a little bit more. Alex talked about, this year we've seen millions of people stand up against racial injustice after George Floyd's murder. And I know you grew up in, you spent that time in Minnesota, a place that's been particularly hard hit by the racial injustice this year. How do you think, you've talked about the racial wealth gap, but how do you think about the intersection of racial justice and the work of Esusu?
So, Amon, I started my journey in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where George Floyd was killed. I know that particular store And I learned how to drive on that road on Enipin. So it was really real for me and brought me to tears. And it just shows you that you're not excluded from a symptom of a larger disease we face in these United States today. And when that happened, I was shocked. I had to call my mother first, make sure she was well. But when we think about our work, it is not it is not any big surprise. If we go back to the history of this country, right? People have been fundamentally left behind. People don't have access to good employment. Income is at an abysmal level. And then the education access we have for folks to get financial prosperity is laughable. So with everything going on, particularly in our society today, it is utterly painful. And having gone through and lived in Minneapolis, it was a really painful experience for me to just live through again, seeing your fellow man, someone that looks just like you, and someone just knelt down on his neck, and you see life literally evaporate out. That's not right. And we need to think about the current structures of our system and really rethink how we do things, because we cannot just realize the true promise of this country if we continue down this path. We need to right the wrongs of the past. But what we do have is we have the resources, we have the people. All we lack at this point is the willingness. There's a lot of hope out there, but hope without a plan is utter fallacy. And that's one of the things we need to do, is to just right this wrong of what society has done. But this is, centuries of systemic inequality we see today.
Abbey and Samir, we just have a minute or two left. What gives you two hope that we can fix these challenges, right these wrongs? Where do we go from here?
Thanks so much for the question. I think one thing that gives me hope is to see how quickly people have been able to mobilize in these times. I think a lot of people prior to 2020 were kind of oblivious, although they shouldn't have been, to some of the issues that have been driven by systemic racism and economic inequality in America. But this year was a wake-up call, and to see how quickly people were able to get something done and move the frontiers forward when needed was really, really uplifting. And I think, to be a little bit more specific here at Esusu, we thought about this time as what was our commitment to action when, COVID-19 hit in the wake of George Floyd's murder. And what we did was launch a rent relief fund so that we could give people who were struggling with COVID-19 free cash so that they could pay their rent and keep their homes and not be on the street where we solve homelessness backwards. And what was really eye-opening was just to see how quickly that grew into something big. It started out with grassroots donations from our friends and family who don't really have that much. And then with the support of folks like Acumen America, we were able to raise some institutional capital to turn this into well over $1 million. And now we're deploying these funds to help and support people. And so just to be able to see how quickly people are able to mobilize when there's a will and there's a forcing mechanism that compels people from their hearts, right? Everyone knows what's right and wrong, but people really need to feel it in their heart and soul to take action, and to see that capability, that potential that we have as a society to make change was uplifting. That being said, we have a work cut out for us as a society. It takes time to overturn years and years, if not hundreds of years of systemic oppression and racism, but I think we can do it, and we need to have a path forward. And what's uplifting is really to see how quickly people can and drive change when they're called to it.
Abbey and Samir, I'll tell you what gives me hope. It's the work of folks like you. So privileged to be in a job where I get to show up and bask in the glow of the amazing things the magic that you make happen every day. We're so grateful for the change that you're leading, and for the good work that you're doing, and for the time that you've shared with us today. This conversation could take hours. We don't have it today, but thank you for spending the last bit with us and for sharing your story.